Today's the day. First new case review of the year, water-cooled Dan A4. Lian Li's A4-H2O launches today. So let's take a look. I'll give you the rundown and we'll take a look at the build process, the performance, and let's see how it all comes together. Welcome to Machines and More. This is a joint effort here. The A4-H2O was designed by Dan Hansen of original sandwich style Dan Case A4 fame, but manufactured, marketed, and sold by Lian Li. Some of you might have seen the pre-release version that Optimum Tech showed us. This is the production version, so there will be quite a few positive improvements here. As the name would suggest, you can think of this simply as a liquid cooling focused A4. Big thanks to Lian Li for sending the case by for the express purpose of making this review. Of course, this video is not sponsored by them, and you can expect an honest and independent review, but we do have a sponsor today. And how about I share a quick word from our sponsor while we take a look at the case next to its SFF peers. This review is being brought to you by the Flexispot Kana Pro Bamboo Standing Desk. The Kana Pro features a bamboo desktop and comes in a variety of desktop sizes, and with the 55-inch version shown, you can comfortably fit a mini-ITX build, or I guess 4, but you're better off with one good build, and you can still fit a whole bunch of other goodies on your desktop. The Kana Pro's keypad makes it really easy to dial in your preferred heights and switch between sitting and standing. And those strong motorized legs supports this bamboo desktop. I really like this satin finished bamboo top. It's a superb feeling, durable work surface. It's dimensionally stable, and since bamboo is a fast growing plant, it can be replenished very quickly as well. Right now, Flexispot is doing their Valentine's Day promo. Details will be down below, so if you or a loved one needs a high quality computing work surface, go check them out. The A4-H2O is very rectangular, square edges all throughout, and the exterior is aluminum. Top panel is 2 millimeters thick, 1.5 millimeters thick on the side and the front, and if you've ever felt an N-Case M1 Classic or TU150, these panels, they feel just like the ones from those, and that's a really good thing because these are excellent, durable panels, and look, nice big holes here for ventilation. This silver one I have here is one of the options, and you also can have a choice of sandblasted black. With the Q58, there were some concerns, right, that the ventilation was a bit too limited on the top panel. If you take a look at this here, very generous ventilation, and that covers the top section, which is reserved for your radiator and your fans. The case comes in at 326 millimeters by 140 wide by 244 millimeters tall. Of course, that doesn't include the protrusions at the back of the case, nor does it include the height of the legs. So that is just the box unit right here. And that will round down to a meager 11 liters. That places it a lot bigger than the original 7.2 liter A4. But it is smaller and closer to the Q58 and the Sub Messlicious and the N-Case M1. Unlike the A4 though, it does take a 240 millimeter rad up to 290 millimeters in length and 55 millimeters thick with fans. The CPU block does have to be under 55 millimeters, but there's going to be plenty of AIOs on the market that fit that block requirement. But actually most of them will get you right up against that thickness limitation, so do double check the radiator and fan thickness there. Another key thing to look for is the way the tubing exits the block. You definitely want one that has flexible elbows that mount to the side of the block. And today I'll be doing this build with the PL240 from Cooler Master, and that satisfies both requirements just fine. And I am swapping out the fans. We're going to be using the best 25 millimeter fans, since with a case like this, you only get 2 fans, so you might as well get the best you can. This case is mini-ITX specific, and the pre-production version of this case featured 2 expansion slots, but thankfully It's scaled with the size of GPUs, and it's been modernized. 3 slots now, GPUs up to 322 millimeters, and that GPU can be a max thickness of about 60-ish millimeters. There's really not too much room beyond that. The GPU is upside down, and it's connected to a hanger bracket which holds it in place, and that is connected to the motherboard's expansion slot via either a PCIe Gen 3 or Gen 4 cable, depending on which version you choose. You'll notice that unlike most sandwich style cases, such as the A4 it's based on, the motherboard is not inverted, and it sits on the left side of the left side panel of the case with the I/O at the rear of the case. And on the right of it is the power supply cage, which will house either an SFX or SFX-L power supply. And of course, I'd recommend SFX power supply just for an easier time with cable management, because you do get more space that way. Moving on down to the side of the case, you'll notice that there is discreetly placed front I/O. And it's really well hidden, but it's quite well featured. Power button, 3.1 Type-C, 3.0 Type-A, HD audio and a mic. For drives, you can fit one 2.5-inch SSD at the bottom. Well, given the state and price of M.2s, if you're really building with a modern board, you can really easily get away without using any SATA drives. So consider that a bonus drive if you need it. There's 2 thumb screws that hold down each panel, but you really don't need them. In fact, I think visually it's more streamlined without them. And the toolless push pin catches hold the panels down very securely. And with the panels off, let's just start our build, and I'll cover a few more features as we go along. To build, it's easiest to remove everything: the power supply cage cover, the top, front, side, and bottom panels, the radiator plate. Remove 1 to 3 slot covers depending on your GPU. Install the I/O shield from your motherboard first. It's advisable to now mount your radiator and fans together. Rad fans should be exhausting, so you can go ahead and set it up that way, but I would just attach it to the radiator plate and then just have it sit in place until you're ready to screw it all down. But I went ahead and connected my splitter cable for the rad fan, since otherwise it's not going to be easily accessible after placing it in there. You will have to watch your rad hardware, because a lot of bigger, round panhead rad screws are going to sit too proud for that top panel to snap back. So I would recommend some lower profile flathead 632s or even countersunk ones. Next, pop in your mini-ITX motherboard. I'd recommend having all the hardware on the board ready to go to attach the cooler. The Cooler Master PL240 we're using is just going to use these stock AM4 brackets, so I'll just leave those on. The board can now be secured down with M3 screws. You can pop in your riser cable into the expansion slot. I would recommend the PCIe Gen 4 version, but if your components are only Gen 3 compatible and you're absolutely sure you won't ever want Gen 4 in the future, then you can save some money there. If you're not ready to attach the block to the CPU yet, you can also go ahead and test fit and route the tubing with the rad fittings on the far side. It's up to you when you want to attach it. You really can do it at any point right now, but personally, I would leave that step till at least the PSU cables and the unit is kind of roughed in place in case you need to move it around in order for the tubing and the cables to play nicely. For a build like this, I like to plug the cables from a modular SFX power supply onto the motherboard first, then back channel those cables to the PSU area. And at this point, also install a SATA data cable if you need for your optional bottom drive. Then do a rough layout for cable management. Plug in your I/O cables, and now I'd also go ahead and lay out the cables for your GPU. One thing I corrected after I connected the I/O cables initially was, instead of routing the USB header cables along the top, I then relocated them along the bottom, and there's a lot more slack for them there, and I think that's where they belong. And you do need to be careful of the cables that run along the radiator, because you don't want the fans to chop your cables up, and there's really nothing stopping it from doing that. Before you install the GPU, it's a good idea to figure out where you want to position the riser cable, since you do want to place the card as close to the side panel as possible. For 2-slot cards like the 3080XC3 that I'm using here from EVGA, and also your 2-slot Ampere Founders Edition cards with those flow-through coolers, you can add in some M3 standoffs to push out the card. For 3-slot cards, you're already at the outer perimeter of the case, so that's where you'll have to stop. But here I could go with the 15mm standoff, since it doesn't actually thread in all the way to the stock standoffs, and that basically pushes the card just about to the outside panel. If you have a very long GPU, you'll notice the cutout at the front. It's nice. Make sure the slot is clear and just slide the card through. And now you can route your cables from the card around to the power supply area. At this point, you can put your power supply in the shroud and connect your cables all back to it. And before you secure it in place, make sure you flick that power button on, because otherwise it'll basically be impossible to do so without reversing everything you just did. If you're using one, the AIO's tubing will straddle the power supply's plug and just screw the shroud in place. Now, if you left your CPU block off until now, now's the time to attach it with some thermal paste. Initially, I checked clearances with the low-profile RAM kit, but after seeing how the tubing run was, in fact, there is more than enough room for a taller RAM kit like Team Group's Extreme 3600 MHz kit here. This is their white version. And we're also pairing that with a Cardia 1TB Gen 4 M.2. This one features a ceramic heatsink. Really cool SSD, and actually great value as well. And a big thanks to them for their help here. One thing I would also do before you put everything together is just to make sure your fans are spinning freely, and you can access them from the GPU side of the house. You're not going to be able to access it from the motherboard side easily. Go ahead and finish tightening your cables. It's very tight at this point, but if you have the cables run to the bottom, you can put that SATA drive, if you have one, and just pop the panels back, and hey, you're good to go. Build is moderate in terms of difficulty. I mean, I still have as much or little hair as I had before, but I definitely wouldn't call this one easy, and there's a lot of little things that you do have to watch out for. And in 11 liters, there's very little tolerance for cable mismanagement. I built this one up with the ASUS B550 ITX and the 3700X combo. And yeah, of course I use this combo for consistency across different cases for thermal testing, and it works just fine for that purpose. But if you're buying new right now, it probably doesn't make too much sense to go Zen 2, right? Because Ryzen 5000 is going to be the much better choice. Or even the ASUS, something like the ASUS B660 ITX we just checked out if you're interested in Alder Lake. But there's plenty of great options out there right now on both the blue and red sides. Big thanks to Noctua for providing the Chromax NFA 12x25s for the build. And these are really ideal fans for a build which needs 25mm fans, and they really don't get any better than these. Let's go ahead and compare this case against some peers in the sub 15 liter space. The AIO and the fan configurations won't be exactly the same, but it won't differ too much, and this comparison here should give you an accurate and fair understanding of the thermal differences. So first off, let's check out our CPU only thermals for Blender. And by the way, these all happen to be Lian Li or Lian Li partner cases. It's not intentional, just, you know, Lian Li has done a lot for this niche. And yes, this is very, very good. In fact, it's top of the charts here. That's simply amazing. The gaming thermals that's really where I would focus on for a real world combined thermal benchmark. It's more reflective of how most users will use their systems. And yeah, for Red Dead 2 here in 1440p, there's not much more to say here. Even with the stock riser cable setup, it's turning in what is a very good result. Very good GPU thermals for this card, which already doesn't have the greatest cooler. Pushing the riser cable out to the outer edge does have a marginal benefit here for the card, and so if you can do that, I'd recommend it. Lastly, let's check out the combined stress test. It's fairly uncommon to have everything pushed to the max at the exact same time, but either way, these are still really fantastic thermals for this stress test. If you take a look at the inverted NR200P build we did recently, of course that is with a tempered glass panel, but that system worked best in intake mode, and it had great CPU thermals, but look at those GPU thermals. They are in fact worse than this guy over here. So 11 liters only, but it uses that as a key advantage. It's really well ventilated, but that key is the flow path is direct. Everything is very close to the outside because it's only 11 liters, right? And that works really well to the advantage of the case. All right, these vents are huge. They're much bigger holes than the more filter-oriented meshlicious panel, and yeah, it's besting all these other cases because of this focus on optimizing airflow over everything else. We will eventually take a look with air cooling. Obviously, H2O is the moniker here, so the priority is to show you guys the liquid cooling capability first and foremost. Compared to something like the Q58, the clearance of the motherboard is just so much less. So your air cooler options here are going to be limited to small units like your stock AMD Wraith Stealth, that new Intel RM1 cooler that's coming with certain Alder Lake SKUs, and that'll work well here. CryoRig C7, Noctua L9 to name a few, for a bigger heatsink, the Alpenfun Black Ridge. Or you can in fact put ID's IS60 EVO without the top fan in there. You have the fan under the heatsink. Obviously, these are all going to be inferior to a 240 radiator, but what can really close the gap in a combined thermals or gaming scenario is the fact that there's really little impact on your CPU cooling from that GPU side of the house, since you can just put your case fans as exhaust and that'll pull in makeup air through the side panels. Overall, this case is very impressive, and although the design and the inclusions are very simple, right, because you just get the case and this little baggie of hardware and the riser cable, it's quite well featured, and you got everything you need here for the most part. It feels like a quality product, and everything down to the recessed and clandestine front I/O. It suggests that a lot of thought and effort was put into making sure that case would look good, it would feel premium, and it would appeal to most SFF enthusiasts. I like the design language here. This layout is different, and I like that. Of course, you don't really see into it, but it's there. And despite the upside down GPU, it just looks right with the motherboard this way. Despite 11 liters being more cramped to build in, the way all the panels come off, including the bottom panel, it's great. This cutout at the front here for the GPU is super convenient. This is a different layout compared to Q58, but that type of ability would have been a nice option. There are a few things that I do want to point out though, and first off, I'm fine with this case being square all around, but it's actually a bit too square on some of these panels. I'm not sure if it's just my review sample, but here are the edges. They're remarkably sharp. See that? And I would be very, very careful. It feels dangerous, and I would have preferred to have a round over machined on the edges, and that would have been unlikely to impact the aesthetics of the case while being a lot safer for the user. So definitely check your case and make sure you don't just like brush your arm when you're across it when you're using it. I'm actually not a big fan of the SSD mounting point. It can work, but it's super cramped under that PSU, and even more cramped if you have an SFX-L. And I think this cutout at the front where the GPU can optionally slide in, that would have been a good place to put a small bracket towards the inside of the case that could hold 1 or 2.5 inches. And I think cabling to there will be fine too. Of course, it's really not going to be a big deal for a lot of folks, but more drive options would have placed this more in the storage league of those slightly larger cousins we just compared to. Since there's not a reasonable rate to mount fan grills that a lot of folks will want, I think a basic cage here with a large cutout to pass the pump head through would work to keep the cables away from the fans. You could put the rad under, but when you're dealing with this kind of tubing space, it's going to be really cramped if you do that. All right, lastly, I think a few pieces of hardware would make this a lot more user-friendly. For example, if you've got something like an Asetek AIO, a lot of them use these pretty big round-headed 632 screws, and just including a few countersunk or lower profile panhead screws would be ideal here, so the user doesn't have to go and source them if they don't have them. Perhaps some optional dust filters. You know, with thermals this good, you might just want to run it without the dust filters, but yeah, maybe some of you will want that. But that would be an option, right? But pretty much everything I mentioned, other than the sharp edges, I think those are all quality of life improvements. And at the core, this V1 is already killer. Pricing for the Gen 3 riser version is coming in at $120 US globally, and $130 for the US market. $35 more for the Gen 4 riser cable version, or $155, $165. So it is quite reasonable compared to the meshlicious and the Q58. Both are in the ballpark. Personally, I'd recommend the Gen 4 version because most of you are going to be building in this with later components, and I think that $35 is going to be well spent. I think this case will be most suited to SFF enthusiasts with moderate cooling needs. I mean, you can cool most consumer CPUs now with a 240, but the one thing you'll want to consider is if you are pairing it with a hotter GPU like I do for test builds here, that's going to place additional burden on the CPU cooling. But honestly, even then, if it's just gaming that you're doing, I'd have no qualms about even a Ryzen 9 or an i9 in here for that purpose. Because of the price and slightly more demanding build process, I do think this is a bit more on the enthusiast level than entry level. I will, of course, do a more in-depth build guide for those of you that are interested eventually. But I think if you're just starting out for this case, you'll want to have a good plan on exactly how you want to cool it. So if you're perhaps starting with a stock AMD or Intel cooler, then you might want to plan for liquid cooling later on. But that's one potential roadmap for some just getting into SFF and those of you that are interested in this case. Lian Li calls this one a tribute to SFF, but I think it's a lot more than that. This one happens to be on the tinier side of the SFF size spectrum, but if it's not at the top, it's getting awfully close to the pinnacle of SFF from pretty much every dimension. Volume, performance. This minimalist design is an elegant disguise for just how much can hide behind these panels. The state of the art can be contained in this 11-liter box. So I hope you enjoyed this first look. For sure it won't be the last look. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Give a like. I'll be leaving some links down below, and we'll be checking out this case again soon, and I'll see you then. This cutout for the GPU at the